The lights are soft, golden, almost nostalgic, the kind of glow that flatters age while honoring history. Agnetha Fältskog, at 75, leans back in her chair like a woman who has finally made peace with every version of herself. Her signature blonde hair still gleams under the studio lights, though a few strands of silver shimmer through, like memories refusing to fade. The years haven't dimmed her, they've only deepened her. And tonight, she isn't here to talk about nostalgia, fame, or the glossy perfection of ABBA. No, tonight, she wants to tell the truth. There's a quiet tension in the air, that mix of curiosity and disbelief that fills a room when an icon hints that masks are about to drop. The interviewer, smiling nervously, asks the question everyone's been too polite to say aloud for decades. Agnetha, at the height of ABBA's fame, you were adored by millions. But who, if anyone, ever tempted you? NSHE pauses, not out of hesitation, but out of delight. Her lips curve into a slow, knowing smile, the kind that says, finally. Oh, darling, she purrs. You want the list, do you? At my age, why pretend anymore? NTHE words hang there, charged, dangerous, delicious. This isn't the shy, soft-spoken girl the world remembers. This is the woman who lived inside her all along. I've sung about dancing, about heartbreak, about love, she says, voice steady, eyes sparkling. But sometimes, while I sang those sweet words, I was thinking about something far less innocent. NHER laughter is rich, warm, unrestrained. The sound of someone shedding the last layer of caution. Let's just say, she adds with a mischievous glint, there were 7 men, all singers, whose voices made me want more than a duet. NTHE interviewer leans forward, startled but fascinated. Agnetha's reputation has always been one of quiet grace, of Nordic purity wrapped in gold and melody. But now, as she leans closer to the microphone, she dismantles that image piece by piece. These weren't crushes, she clarifies. They were fantasies. Hot, shameless fantasies. Men who made me forget choreography, rip off sequins, and think about nothing but sin. There's a long silence, not awkward, but electric. Every word feels like it could explode into a headline. For so long, Agnetha had been the angelic half of a pop dream, a woman whose heartbreaks were sold as songs and whose desires were silenced behind stage smiles. But now, 75 and unfiltered, she's reclaiming every untold story. And I behaved well, she continues, eyes glinting like diamonds. Mostly. But if I'd let myself go, oh, the scandals you'd still be writing about. She laughs again, unbothered by what anyone might think. For the first time, the woman who spent decades being adored finally looks like she's enjoying it. NTHE interviewer tries to press further, asking if she's ready to reveal names. Agnetha's gaze sharpens, playful and wicked all at once. Why not? She says. I've got nothing left to hide. Let's tell the truth. Beautifully, honestly, and maybe a little scandalously. These 7 men, these icons, these devils in leather, they made me want to sin. And at 75, I don't give a damn who knows it. It's a declaration, raw, powerful, and thrilling. The pop princess who once sang of lost love and bittersweet goodbyes now laughs like a woman who's finally free. As the camera zooms in, her expression softens, not with regret, but with satisfaction. You know, she whispers, people always saw me as the blonde angel of ABBA. But angels have wings for a reason. To fly close to heaven, yes, but sometimes to flirt with the fire below. And with that final line, the audience realizes, this isn't a confession. It's a rebirth. It began where every ABBA story begins, inside a studio thick with sound, sweat, and unspoken desire. Benny Andersson, the bearded maestro with eyes that could slice through any melody, sat hunched over his piano, conjuring symphonies out of air. Across the room stood Agnetha, blonde, radiant, and heartbreakingly young, her voice trembling with both nerves and something else, something that made her pulse race whenever he played. NTO, the public, They were bandmates, co-creators of pop perfection. But behind closed doors, the music told a different story. Each time Benny's fingers grazed the ivory keys, she felt the vibration in her bones. His music wasn't just notes, it was a secret language, one that spoke directly to the parts of her she'd kept hidden. "He didn't have to touch me," she later confessed with a half-smile, "because his songs already did." In those early days, ABBA was still climbing toward immortality. Late-night rehearsals stretched into early mornings. Empty wine glasses littered the studio floor. And somewhere between takes of Waterloo and Mamma Mia, an invisible line began to blur. When Benny would look up from the piano, their eyes met and lingered just a second too long. That single, dangerous second where art and attraction intertwined. Agnetha had always admired his brilliance. Benny wasn't handsome in the traditional sense, but his genius had its own kind of seduction, quiet, deliberate, and irresistible. She watched how effortlessly he commanded the room, how even silence seemed to obey him. And when he smiled, that rare, crooked grin of his, it felt like a melody no one else could hear. N-B-U-T temptation inside ABBA's world was a dangerous rhythm. Everyone already whispered about relationships and rivalries. Björn Ulvaeuson's real-life husband was always nearby, sharp-eyed and protective, watching as the chemistry between his wife and his bandmate began to flicker beneath the surface. "We were all playing with fire," Agnetha admits now, "and the studio was full of matches. There were moments that could have changed everything." One night, after hours of recording, Benny asked her to stay behind, to, quote, "try one more harmony." The others had gone home. The air was still. She sat beside him, the scent of coffee and cologne mixing in the heat of the small room. He began to play a soft, unfinished tune, something haunting and slow. Their shoulders brushed. Their laughter faded. For a heartbeat, she thought he might lean in. But instead, he just kept playing, eyes closed, lost in the music. "NTHAT song," she says, "never made it to an album. Maybe because it wasn't meant for the world. It belonged to a moment that almost was. There's a version of us that never happened," she muses now. And maybe that's why the music worked, because the tension stayed inside the songs. Years later, when ABBA disbanded, Benny and Agnetha would both move on. Different lives, different loves, but the memory of that electricity never quite faded. She describes it as unfinished business wrapped in harmony. Even today, when she hears one of his old melodies, she says it pulls her back to that smoky room where love hummed just beneath the piano's hum. "I think he knew," she admits quietly. "We both did. But some stories are more powerful when they never happen." Benny would go on to become a legend, a composer of musicals, a man who defined a generation of sound. But for Agnetha, he would always be the first man who made her question the boundary between creation and desire. And maybe that's why her voice carried such aching beauty, because behind every note was the echo of a temptation she never touched, but never truly forgot. NSHE laughs now when she remembers how fans once speculated about their closeness. "They thought we were perfect," she says. "They had no idea how close we came to ruining that perfection." In the end, Benny remained her mirror in music, the man who played the chords to her most secret emotions. And though they never crossed that forbidden line, the chemistry between them burned quietly for decades, hidden beneath lyrics that millions would sing, never knowing they were humming the sound of two hearts that almost collided. If Benny was the slow burn, the steady, intellectual fire that lingered behind the music, Andy Gibb was the wildfire, unpredictable, young, reckless, and achingly beautiful. When Agnetha Fältskog first met Andy Gibb, the youngest Bee Gees brother, she was already an icon, a goddess of melody and mystery. He, on the other hand, was the industry's newest heartthrob, barely in his 20s, all soft curls and dangerous dimples. To the world, he was the golden boy who sang about shadow dancing. But to Agnetha, he was temptation personified, the living embodiment of everything she'd tried to suppress under ABBA's polished perfection. They met backstage at a television special in London, a night drenched in starlight and champagne. He walked in wearing a cream suit, flashing that disarming Gibbs smile, and for a brief second, time seemed to stutter. He looked like trouble, she recalls with a glint in her eye, and I was tired of behaving. Nandy was open about his admiration. He wasn't subtle, not even a little. The tabloids had already linked him to starlets and singers, but with Agnetha, he seemed genuinely enchanted. "You're my dream girl," he told her that night. "The blonde voice that made me fall in love before I even met you." It was cheesy, yes, but it worked. Because he meant it. And sincerity from a man like Andy was a rare and dangerous thing. Their flirtation began innocently enough. A few backstage smiles, long conversations between rehearsals, the occasional late-night phone call that lasted until dawn. But there was always that undercurrent, the soft current of something forbidden. Agnetha was older, wiser, and still reeling from her divorce with Bjorn. Andy was pure, unfiltered youth. He represented what she'd lost: spontaneity, excitement, the thrill of being desired without consequence. When they were together, she felt her age melt away. "He made me feel 20 again," she says softly. "Like every rule I'd lived by could suddenly be rewritten." Rumors began to swirl almost immediately. Paparazzi caught glimpses of them laughing too closely at award after-parties or slipping out of recording studios at odd hours. Andy didn't hide it. He wanted the world to know he adored her. "He'd send flowers to my dressing room," she laughs, "and once he sent a note that said, 'If I were older, you'd be in trouble.' I wrote back, 'Who says you have to be older?' It was a dangerous game." ABBA was still one of the biggest bands in the world, their image built on discipline and near-perfect control. But behind the scenes, Agnetha was slowly unbuttoning her own restraint. "He was like sunlight," she recalls. "Too bright, too warm, too fleeting." There was one night, one she still remembers vividly, when their chemistry almost became scandal. They were both invited to a private industry gathering in Stockholm. Music legends everywhere, laughter echoing, champagne flowing endlessly. At some point, they found themselves alone on the balcony, city lights flickering below. The air was cold, but Andy's hand was warm against hers. He leaned in, not too close, but close enough for her to smell his cologne, close enough for her heart to lose its rhythm. "He looked at me like I was the only woman alive," she says. And for that moment, I wanted to believe it. But then came the hesitation, the brief, sobering reminder of who she was. Agnetha Fältskog, the golden girl, the mother, the voice that millions adored. If she gave in, it wouldn't just be passion, it would be headlines. And Andy, beautiful, impulsive Andy, wasn't built for discretion. "And I think he wanted to be my escape," she says. "But I wasn't ready to be saved." Still, that night never left her. She remembers how his thumb brushed the edge of her hand, how his laughter faded into silence, and how the moment ended before it began. Andy would go on to struggle with fame, with loneliness, with the weight of his own success. And though their connection never became a full-blown affair, Agnetha carries a quiet sorrow when she speaks of him now. "He was too pure for that world," she says, voice softening. "Everyone wanted something from him. I just wanted him to keep smiling." Years later, when Andy died so tragically young, the news hit her harder than she expected. She hadn't spoken to him in years, yet when she heard, she locked herself in her room and played his songs for hours. "It was like listening to a ghost," she admits. "A voice from a time when I almost let myself fall." NSAG still keeps one of his old letters, a folded, faded note written in his messy scrawl. It says only one line: "You make me believe that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real. NFOR, a woman who'd built her entire life on control. That single sentence meant everything. It was the reminder that behind the glimmer of ABBA and the fame, she was still human, capable of yearning, of weakness, of wanting something that could destroy her. And maybe that's why she never regrets the temptation. Andy Gibb wasn't a mistake. He was a moment, brief, brilliant, and gone too soon. When I think of him now, she says with a wistful smile, I don't feel guilt, I feel warmth. Because for a short while, someone looked at me like I wasn't a singer, or a legend, or an icon. I was just a woman he couldn't stop dreaming about. NSHE pauses, then adds quietly, and if I'd given in that night, the sheets wouldn't have stood a chance. If Andy Gibb had made her blush, Rod Stewart made her burn. The contrast couldn't have been greater. Andy was all softness and innocence, but Rod was a storm in silk. He carried himself like a man who'd tasted every pleasure the world had to offer and still wanted more. Their paths crossed during the height of the late 70s, when ABBA was ruling Europe and Rod was conquering America, his raspy voice dripping from radios across the globe. They met at a glitzy after-party in Los Angeles, the kind of night that smelled of perfume, power, and too much champagne. Agnetha remembers the moment he walked in, tight leopard print shirt, that unmistakable blonde mane, and eyes that knew exactly how to find trouble. He had this presence, she recalls, still half laughing. Like he could walk into a room and make everyone's heartbeat sync to his. Rod didn't waste a second. He sauntered over, whiskey in hand, and said, "So you're the angel everyone keeps singing about. Tell me, do angels ever misbehave?" It was a line straight from his playbook, bold, arrogant, and perfectly effective. Agnetha couldn't help but blush, caught between amusement and intrigue. "I told him," she laughs, "only when the devil plays the right tune." And he grinned, because he knew he was the devil in that moment. From that night on, a playful tension brewed between them. They'd run into each other at award shows, after-parties, and charity galas, always exchanging teasing smiles, always walking the fine line between flirtation and fantasy. Rod had a way of making her forget the rules. He was magnetic, she says. The kind of man who didn't ask for permission. He just made you want to say yes. And one memory stands out vividly in her mind. It was a London charity ball, sometime around 1978. The music had faded, the champagne was running low, and Rod, ever the provocateur, pulled her onto the empty dance floor. He held her close, singing quietly into her ear, his gravelly voice vibrating against her skin. The song wasn't one of his own, but an old standard, The Way You Look Tonight. He didn't sing it like a performance, she recalls softly. He sang it like a promise, NFOR a moment. The world felt still. Just her, the raspy whisper of his voice, and the heat of his hand pressed against the small of her back. He whispered something scandalous then. She admits with a smile that borders on wicked. Something no one had ever dared to say to me. I can't repeat it, but it made me blush so hard I had to look away. NTHAT was Rod's charm. He knew exactly how to leave you dizzy and curious, wanting more but never quite daring to take it. He had that mix of danger and delight, she muses. Like if I let him in, he'd ruin me, but I'd thank him for it. They never crossed that final line. The flirtation remained an unspoken song, a melody that lingered long after the party lights dimmed. Rod would go on to marry, divorce, and live the wild rock star life everyone expected of him. But Agnetha says he always carried that glint, that mischief that never quite faded. Rod was the reminder that even the most angelic hearts have a taste for sin, she says now, her voice laced with humor and a hint of nostalgia. And maybe that's what makes life exciting, knowing you could, but choosing not to. Then, with a sly grin, she adds, "Still, if he'd asked one more time, I might have let the devil dance." Of all Agnetha Fältskog's confessions, none carried the same electric shock as the one involving Annie Fried Lyngstad, the other half of ABBA's legendary female duo. To the public, they were musical sisters. mirror images in sequence and harmony. But behind the glitter, beneath the spotlights, their connection was more complicated, more intimate, and far more dangerous than anyone imagined. And for years, fans speculated about the dynamic between the two women, the way they moved together on stage, their synchronized glances, their shared laughter that sometimes seemed too knowing. People always said we had chemistry. Agnetha smiles now, but they didn't realize how right they were. It began as friendship, two women bound by fame, isolation, and an understanding that no one else could share. They spent endless hours together on the road, in dressing rooms, sharing secrets whispered between hairbrushes and mirrors. We were surrounded by men, managers, producers, bandmates, but Frida was my calm, Agnetha recalls. She understood every storm inside me. NTHAT closeness deepened during ABBA's most chaotic years. The constant pressure of fame, failing relationships, and grueling schedules had worn them both thin. There were nights after shows when they'd collapse onto a couch in their dressing room, still glowing with sweat and adrenaline, laughing through exhaustion. Sometimes we'd just sit there, holding hands, not saying a word, Agnetha says quietly. It felt safe. It felt like home. NBUT safety has a way of turning into something else when emotions run deep. One night in 1979, during their world tour, they found themselves alone after a performance in Paris. The crowd had roared, the cameras had flashed, and the applause still echoed in their veins. Back at the hotel, the others went out for drinks, but Agnetha and Frida stayed behind. We opened a bottle of wine, she says, and for the first time, we talked about what it meant to be women in this strange, beautiful prison called fame. They talked for hours about love, loneliness, and the ache of being desired by millions, but truly known by no one. The room grew quiet. The air thickened with something unnamed. Frida reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Agnetha's face, her touch light but deliberate. It was such a small gesture, Agnetha remembers, but it felt like an earthquake. There was no grand moment, no dramatic confession. Just a look, one long, unbroken look between two women who understood each other too well. For a heartbeat, the line between friendship and desire blurred. If we'd been left alone a little longer, Agnetha says with a teasing smile, those satin costumes might not have survived the night. They never spoke about it afterward, not directly. But something shifted between them. On stage, their chemistry became undeniable. During performances of Knowing Me, Knowing You, audiences would swear they were acting out heartbreak. But Agnetha insists the emotion was real. Not about lost men, but about each other. We sang that song to one another sometimes, she confesses. We were telling a story neither of us dared to live. In the years that followed, the tension became both a blessing and a curse. It fueled their performances, gave their harmonies a haunting depth. But it also made distance necessary. You can't live forever on the edge of something forbidden, Agnetha admits. Eventually, one of you has to pull back. And after ABBA disbanded, their friendship cooled, not from anger, but from quiet understanding. They needed space, time, normalcy. But even now, decades later, Agnetha speaks of Frida with warmth and a touch of melancholy. She was my reflection, she says softly. The only person who saw the real me, the woman behind the perfect hair, the perfect smile. When asked if she regrets never exploring that connection further, Agnetha pauses for a long time. Her eyes flicker with the kind of honesty that can't be rehearsed. Regret? No, she finally says. But sometimes I wonder what might have happened if the world hadn't been watching. If it had just been the two of us, no cameras, no expectations, maybe we would have written a very different song. Frida, for her part, has remained discreet about that chapter. But whenever the two women reunite for an ABBA event, fans notice it. The lingering hand on a shoulder, the shared laughter, the old spark that refuses to die. People always ask what it's like to stand beside someone who knows every note of your soul, Agnetha says. I tell them it's terrifying and beautiful because sometimes the most dangerous love isn't between a man and a woman. It's between two people who make each other feel seen. NSHE smiles then, a mix of nostalgia and mischief. Frida and I were harmony and contrast, light and fire. Maybe we never needed to cross that line. Maybe singing together was already intimate enough. Then with that, the angel of ABBA leaves her most delicate confession hanging in the air, a love story that existed between the notes, in the silences, and in the songs that made the world believe in magic. By the late 70s, Agnetha Fältskog was no stranger to admiration. Men had written songs for her, fallen at her feet, even tattooed her name. But no one embodied raw, unapologetic masculinity quite like Tom Jones. He was the Welsh lion of lust, the man whose voice could make even the most reserved woman feel suddenly reckless. And for Agnetha, he wasn't just a fantasy. He was a temptation wrapped in velvet and fire. They met in London, at a charity event that had gathered the elite of music royalty. Tom, with his unmistakable swagger and that low, teasing grin, was already halfway through a glass of champagne when he spotted her across the room. She wore a pale blue gown that shimmered like moonlight, elegant, effortless, and utterly magnetic. He looked at me, she recalls with a laugh, like I was something he wanted to unwrap slowly. When he approached, his voice carried that familiar deep drawl, smooth, playful, laced with danger. "So you're the angel from ABBA," he said. "I've been wondering if you sound as sweet when you whisper." It was the kind of line only Tom Jones could deliver. Brazen, shameless, yet somehow charming enough to make even Agnetha blush. NSHE wasn't used to men disarming her so easily. Tom had that rare power, a charisma that didn't demand attention but consumed it. He didn't flirt like the others, she admits. He conquered the air around him. You couldn't breathe properly when he was near. Throughout the evening, he stayed close. They laughed, they teased, and as the night grew warmer, she found herself leaning closer, caught in the gravitational pull of his energy. When he touched her arm, a simple, passing gesture, she felt the shock ripple straight through her. His hand, she says, had that kind of heat that made your thoughts lose their manners. There was a moment later that evening that would linger with her for years. The party had thinned out. The music was soft, the lights low. Tom suggested they step out onto the terrace for some air. She agreed, perhaps against her better judgment. London's night air was cool, but standing beside him, it felt like the world had gone feverish. He was telling me a story about his early days, she remembers. How he used to sing in smoky pubs where women would throw their hotel keys at him. I laughed, and he said, "Don't tell me you've never thought about it." Giving someone the key, just once. Agnetha froze, not out of discomfort, but because the question sliced straight through her composure. She met his eyes, dark, magnetic, and filled with the kind of promise that made logic irrelevant. "I told him I'd lost my key," she says now, smiling. "And he said, 'Then I'll just have to sing the door open.'" It was outrageous, and yet for that fleeting instant she wanted to believe he could. They didn't cross that line, not that night, not ever. But the energy between them was unmistakable. Every time they met afterward, at award shows, talk shows, or parties, that same charge flickered to life again, like static electricity that refused to die. NTOM, for all his bravado, had a surprising gentleness beneath the surface. He admired her for more than her beauty. He told me once, she says softly, that when I sang, I didn't just use my voice, I used my soul. That meant more to me than any compliment I'd ever had. NHE was bold, yes, but he never pushed her. He knew the difference between temptation and disrespect. Tom had this rare balance, she recalls. He could make you feel desired without making you feel cheap. That's a gift, and he knew exactly how to use it. NBUT. Beneath the laughter and teasing, there was something deeper, a mutual recognition. Both were icons, trapped by the expectations of fame. Both had to smile when they wanted to scream. In that understanding, they shared a silent connection, a kind of empathy, born from being adored by millions, yet understood by few. People think passion is just about bodies, Agnetha muses. But sometimes it's about energy, that invisible pull between two souls who recognize each other. Years later, when she saw him perform Delilah Live Again, older, grayer, but still radiating that impossible vitality, she felt the same spark. It was strange, she admits. Even at 75, that man could walk into a room and make you forget your own name. And though their flirtation remained only that, a beautiful, suspended almost, Agnetha cherishes it as one of her favorite secrets. Tom Jones was living proof, she says, that some men don't age out of desire. They just learn how to carry it better. Then, with a smile both innocent and knowing, she adds, if he'd sung just one more song that night, I might have dropped the champagne and the halo. Long before the world crowned her the angel of ABBA, Agnetha Fältskog was a dreamer. A Swedish girl from Jönköping who fell asleep to the sound of a record player spinning slow, sultry songs about love and loneliness. And among all those voices that filled her teenage nights, two stood above the rest, Elvis Presley and David Bowie. They were not just musicians to her. They were worlds unto themselves. Two very different faces of desire. Elvis, she begins, her voice soft with nostalgia, was the first man I ever loved who didn't know I existed. NSHE was still a teenager when she saw him on a small black and white TV, that impossibly perfect face, that smirk, those hips that seemed to move in defiance of gravity and good manners. He was everything I wasn't allowed to want, she laughs. And that made me want him even more. Years later, when ABBA's fame exploded, Agnetha had the surreal realization that her idol might actually know her name. Someone told me Elvis had heard Dancing Queen, she says. I didn't believe it, but then a friend who worked in the U.S. music circuit said Elvis called it beautiful. I couldn't breathe when I heard that. I thought, if that's true, I can die happy. NSHE never met him, but she often imagined what would have happened if she had. I used to picture myself at Graceland, she confesses with a mischievous grin. He'd walk in wearing that leather suit, and I'd be standing there pretending to be calm. He'd say something smooth, I'd laugh too loud, and then it would all go terribly right. When she laughs at herself now, it's not embarrassment, it's affection. Elvis was fantasy, she says, pure, golden, unreachable fantasy. He made me understand that sometimes desire isn't meant to be touched. It's meant to live in your imagination, because that's where it stays perfect. NBUT. Then, there was Bowie. NIF. Elvis was the god of her youth. Bowie was the devil of her adulthood. Strange, seductive, and impossible to define. He wasn't conventionally beautiful. He was fascinating, dangerous in his calm. Bowie was like a mirror that showed you your wildest self, she says. He made people question everything. Gender, beauty, sanity, love. I adored that. NSHE met him once, briefly, fleetingly, at a music awards show in 1980. ABBA had just performed, and Bowie was there, draped in a black suit and quiet confidence. He didn't walk, she recalls. He glided, like he'd come from another planet and was still deciding whether to stay. NHE stopped to speak to her, just for a moment. He said, "You have the voice of light." And then he smiled. That Bowie smile, where it's half sincere, half secret. I don't even remember what I said back. I think I just stared. NTHAT single encounter haunted her for decades. Not because of what was said, but because of what lingered in the silence after. It was like he'd looked straight through me, and for a second I didn't want to look away. Bowie represented everything she wasn't allowed to be, wild, androgynous, unafraid. He lived without apology, while she had spent years perfecting the art of polite restraint. I envied him, she admits. He could change faces, change sounds, change truths, and the world loved him more for it. I sang about love, but he was love in every strange, dangerous form. And as time passed, that fascination only deepened. She collected his records, studied his lyrics, and even admitted that a few of her solo songs were quietly inspired by him. When I wrote about longing, she confides, I was thinking of Bowie, not him exactly, but what he represented: freedom, mystery, the courage to be undone. When asked if she ever imagined being with him, she laughed softly. Of course, but Bowie wasn't a man you had. He was an experience. And part of me thinks if I'd ever been close to him, I might never have come back the same. In her later years, after Bowie's death, Agnetha revisited his music with a kind of reverence, as though listening to a ghost who'd once whispered her name. He made people feel seen in their strangeness, she says quietly. And maybe that's why I loved him, because deep down, I've always felt a little strange myself. NSHE pauses, then smiles faintly. I used to imagine a world where Elvis, Bowie, and I could all sit in the same room, the past, the future, and everything in between. Elvis would flirt, Bowie would philosophize, and I'd probably just sit there trying to remember how to breathe. That's the beauty of Agnetha's confessions. They're not regrets, they're portraits of who she was, and who she still dares to be. A woman who lived her fantasies honestly, even if only in her mind. NBY, the end of the interview. She seems lighter, like each confession has lifted a hidden weight. She leans back, smiling that soft, knowing smile the world fell in love with decades ago, and says, I've spent my life singing about love. But what people didn't know was that some of those songs, they weren't about perfect love. They were about forbidden love, imagined love, dangerous love. NHER voice trails off for a moment, lost somewhere between memory and melody. Then she adds, at 75, why pretend anymore? I'm not just the angel of ABBA. I'm a woman who's loved, lusted, dreamed, and dared. Even if only in silence. NSHE laughs then. A beautiful, unguarded laugh that feels like sunlight after decades of restraint. If that makes me scandalous, she says, then maybe I've finally earned my wings. And with that, Agnetha Fältskog, the voice of innocence, the queen of heartbreak, the woman who sang love into immortality, closes her eyes for a moment, as if replaying every note, every man, every fantasy. Some desires, after all, aren't meant to be confessed. But when they are, they sound exactly like this, soft, fearless, and forever unforgettable.